Hello and welcome to the fourth of 6 presentations in the Global Motivations Lecture Series. My name is Matthew Hughes and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City. We're so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. Whether you're joining us live now or viewing the recording later, we invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events and how to join the IRC as a member on our website at irckc.org. The global rebalance of power continues. The ambitions, alliances, and actions of world powers have accelerated shifts in the international order that was framed in the waning days of the Second World War. What interests countries on the world stage today? What outcomes do they seek, and what role do cooperation and competition play? In this 6-part virtual series, we're painting a picture of 6 world powers, their internal and external drivers, their evolving role in the community of nations, and what this means for the rest of the world. We hope you'll engage with us today as we explore the motivations of India. We certainly welcome your thoughtful questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share other IRC conversations as we consider a range of critical issues in the coming weeks. We're grateful to our sponsors who have made today's program and the Global Motivations Lecture Series possible. In particular, sustaining series sponsors Cyprian Simkowitz and Jerry White, and the University of St. Mary, and supporting series sponsor Burns and McDonnell. Thanks also to sustaining conversation sponsor Nicole Gresham Perry. Thank you for finding value in these conversations. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's program, who will help us dive into India's global motivations. Tamanna Salikuddin is Director of South Asia Programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she oversees USIP's work in Pakistan and broader South Asia. She comes into this role with extensive regional expertise in Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and Sri Lanka, particularly in political and demographic trends in the region. She joined USIP after 12 years in the US government focused on South Asia and conflict resolution. And before joining the US government, she worked as an attorney on international law issues in South Asia. Tamanna, we're so glad to have you with us again today. Thank you so much, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you to IRC and everybody out in Kansas City for hosting me this afternoon. And it's a pleasure to speak with you all. I think this is a really interesting series, to think about the changing lens and through which we see the world. And India is pivotal in that moment. I want to offer some opening observations, but I want to spend the bulk of our hour in question and answer. The US-India relationship has really transformed over 75 years since the independence of India, from one of simple recognition from their independence in 1947 to a period of, I would argue, mutual distance during the Cold War, to a period of hyphenated Indo-Pakistan, Indo-Pak connection during the 1980s and 1990s when we had sanctions due to nuclear tests, and finally to a defining partnership for the 21st century. And really during the last 2 decades, you've seen a bipartisan consensus on this. And so why is India so important? I mean, you can make a lot of observations. It's a large country, population-wise, land size-wise, and it's set to even overtake China as the most populous country of the world. It's in a very strategic location. I often talk about how it's the only place in the world, where India, Pakistan, and China border, where you have 3 active 3 borders that are actively contested between 3 nuclear armed powers. So it is not a quiet location by any means. And I mean, in the recent years, we've seen them just having an emergent, strong economy, strong tech sector, all of these things. We have a vibrant diaspora from India, not just in the US, but all over the world. If we look at CEOs of major companies from Google to, Starbucks, you're going to see the Indian diaspora present. So, I mean, it is a country that people are, sitting up and taking notice to. But I think today we want to talk a little bit more. If you see the Biden administration's recent national security strategy as was released, and today the National Defense Secretary Austin, just released the strategy today, and it talks about the biggest priority for the United States, even before Russia, it argues, is deterring aggression while being prepared to prevail in conflict when necessary, prioritizing the PRC or China challenge in the Indo-Pacific region. And when it talks about how do we actually deal with that challenge, it's looking at US alliances and security partnerships in the Indo-Pacific region. So leveraging the growing capabilities and economic influence of these. And first and foremost there is really India. And so you have what is really a bipartisan consensus, both on the Hill in the legislative branch, but over several US administrations. I would say it started nascently with the Bush administration, but really from 2008, you see a big change in how the United States deals with India, right? We come out of a period of sanctions in the 1990s. And this really mirrors, if you think about it, us leaving what you could argue post-Cold War was a unipolar world where the United States was the great power in the 90s. The rules of the international regime were kind of set by the United States to a period post 2001, where we are really mired in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the emergence of a multipolar reality. And that multipolar reality has really mirrored the US-India alliance. Of note, when we entered Afghanistan, which I spent a lot of my career in government working on, in 2001, India and China were not these huge economic behemoths. 20 years later, they are a force to be reckoned with, not just in their region, but across Asia, across the world. So you have really seen a change. But I want to note some of the important developments. I think in September of 2008, nuclear energy regulators allowed the India nuclear trade. So this was the Civ nuke deal. It was a hard-fought deal during the Obama administration. But basically, it removed India from this purgatory of sanctions on its nuclear use. This had been started before the Obama administration. It was finalized, but it was really the Bush administration that worked on this for years and years and years. And Secretary Rice had really lobbied all her foreign counterparts to support the waiver. And analysts say this deal was really critical to India's economic growth and satisfying its increasing energy demands. Fast forward in 2010, you have then Obama administration officials signing, Secretary of Treasury launches the economic partnership with India. So we launch a new US-India economic and financial partnership. We meet at the highest levels to really deepen bilateral relations on economic and financial sector issues. This really leads the way to liberalization of our trade. Now you can buy California walnuts and Washington apples in India. You couldn't before. And there was a lot of protectionism. Similarly, you can get Indian mangoes, or you all are from Missouri, I'm from Ohio. It's rare. You'd never see an Indian tractor before, but now in the cornfields of Ohio, you see Indian-made Mahindra tractors. So, I mean, this is a real sea change in terms of the trade between the two countries. In 2010, India and the United States hold their first strategic dialogue. This is the largest, highest ranking delegation of Indian officials to visit Washington, D.C. And at that point, Secretary of State Clinton lauds India as an indispensable partner. We have several visits of Prime Minister Singh. And then in May of 2014, President Obama then welcomes Prime Minister Modi, which is a big deal because Modi, when he was chief minister of the state of Gujarat, was implicated in a massacre of Muslims in the state, and he had a visa ban in the US. And so this was a big deal. It was a signal when you invite Modi to the White House. And now he's visited several times, and subsequent presidents have visited Delhi many times. I think you see beyond trade and diplomatic relations, you really see the defense partnership really taking off as well. In 2016, President Obama recognizes India as a major defense partner. This is Prime Minister Modi and President Obama meeting at the White House, and they elevate India to a major defense partner, a status no other country holds. And it's an expansion of a 10-year defense agreement that was renewed in 2015. And really, this cements a pathway to cooperation on a lot of defense sectors, defense technology, et cetera. In 2018, you have then under the Trump administration, you have a 2+2 dialogue where Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis signed an agreement with their Indian counterparts, CASA, which is Communications Compatibility and the Security Agreement. This gives India access to advanced communication technology used in US defense equipment and allows for real-time information sharing. And then in 2020, something that when I was in government, we never thought we were pushing and we never thought we could get to, we actually signed an intelligence deal, Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement, BECA, which was really the last piece of the puzzle in the foundational military agreements between the countries. So in a short period, I would argue, really in 20 years, you've gone to a place where we thought of India really as India, Pakistan, and thinking about nuclear weapons and how do we prevent crisis on the subcontinent, to really now what I would argue is a fundamental relationship in a very, very different way. And so where are we now? I mean, you are in a partnership, and how does India see this? So for India, the US is the most comprehensive strategic partner. The cooperation, as I mentioned, is across multiple areas: trade, defense, multilateralism, intelligence, cyberspace, civ, nuke, energy, education, healthcare, you name it, we're cooperating with them, both in the government and non-government spheres. In recent years, we've worked together on COVID-19 pandemic. Really, India's vaccine and other pharma industries have been a lifesaver, not just for the US, but for the rest of the world. Really importantly, as we're thinking about Indo-Pacific, the lens now of countering China, India is a huge partner. And I mean, when we changed the Pacific Command in Hawaii to the Indo-Pacific Command, that was one signal. But now, as we work really to broaden what it means, a rules-based international order in the Indo-Pacific, and the Quad partnership between India, US, Australia, and Japan, these are all partnerships to really counter China, but also to offer, to really be a presence in broader Asia and these countries working together there. We have worked on other things beyond security. I think humanitarian aid, disaster relief, peacekeeping, space, cybersecurity, a lot of different things. And finally, we've really India looks to the US towards strengthening global value chains and enhancing the two-way foreign direct investment, providing incentives for the private sector to make more investments. But that as well has really grown over many years. So what is India thinking? I mean, India has historically, it's not that its foreign policy has never been one of let's jump in one camp or another. I think it is this non-alignment has been in India's DNA post-colonial period. It was even before it was a leader of the non-aligned movement, it really thought of itself as not jumping in one camp or another. And I think in a multipolar world, it realizes that it has to maintain multiple relationships, right? And so that is the reality you face today. And very quickly, I'm sure we're going to talk more about this. China, first and foremost, every meeting with India, they will remind us the basis of why we are cooperating. It is to counter China's influence across Asia, China's dominance. This, early on, and I think there were periods when the US tried to cooperate a lot more with China. India had a bit, India is so enmeshed with China in terms of economy, in terms of in terms of technology, that it's really hard to separate them. And early on in the Xi administration, there was this outreach to Modi and a try to make India-China partnership strong. This has really shifted since 2020. The line of actual control, the disputed border between India and China in the summer of 2020, this is a place where there are no tanks, there are no guns, and yet you had the bloodiest incident where Indian and Chinese soldiers in the heights of the Himalayas are bludgeoning each other to death with really clubs. And I mean, it was a terrible, terrible incident, But that Galwan incident in the summer of 2020 has shifted India calculus and its perception of China, and it really has cemented US-India cooperation in terms of countering China. So I can't understate how important China is in terms of India's calculus, but I would note that how they approach China is also very different than how the US does. As is the case for most countries in Asia, you can't cut off relations with China. I mean, even for the US, we're too interdependent, but countering China is definitely top of the list. Russia, so we can get into this, you know, India has a long-term relationship with Russia. And the invasion of Ukraine has turned out to be a nightmare in some ways for the Indians. You know, the Indians in the multipolar world wanted to balance their relationship with Russia and their relationship with the US. They wanted to they understood that we hated each other. We were, you know, since the Cold War, we have not been on, seen eye to eye. And yet they, their legacy relationship was something they couldn't get over for two reasons. One is political, right? They have a deep political relationship with Russia. I think we can't understate the Cold War period, and even to this day when Russia goes to the mat for them in terms of vetoes at the UN General Assembly, et cetera, other places. And importantly, they don't want Russia to get closer to their number one enemies, China and Pakistan. But two is the actual bigger thing. You know, their energy and military dependence on Russia is not something they can turn off overnight. I mean, you can see that Europe is suffering when Russia cut off natural gas supplies. I mean, if you're, keeping up with this, the prices have gone not one or twofold. Your 800% increases energy prices. India, as a poorer nation, just can't do that. And so they are not violating any sanctions, but they continue to get energy from Russia. Two, it will take decades for India to wean itself off Russian-made artillery, any of its equipment. So almost all of its weapon systems are connected, are parts or wholesale from the Russians. Obviously, they are looking to diversify. They look to the US. We don't sell them everything. They look to Israel. They look to France. They look to indigenization. They want to build it themselves. All great and worthy aims, not something you can do in a year, not something you can do in 10 years. And so the reality is, and I'm happy to talk about this more, the Indians, while they have quietly condemned, pushed for diplomatic solutions on Ukraine, they are very much against the invasion of Ukraine, but they've had quiet conversations in the US, and we understand, I think US policymakers understand the conundrum, right, for the Indians. I think the most vocal they've been is sort of the statement that Modi made at the SCO summit recently, directly in a meeting with Putin. But again, these are all choreographed statements. The Russians understand where India is, and India is not going to vote against Russia at the UN. Last, I want to talk about, obviously, Pakistan. Pakistan, since the creation of India, for those of you who know your history, this is a country that's created out of partition, out of independence from British colonialism. They continue to have disputes. Both militaries, really, their doctrine and their first and foremost enemies remain each other. Though the Indians, in some ways have moved on. They'd like to say that Pakistan's is no longer that important for them. It's just an irritant or source of terrorism, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, in moments, for example, recently when the US supplied, $400 million of upkeep for the F-16s in Pakistan, the Indians were very, very livid, right? So as much as they want to ignore Pakistan and be the bigger country and be a world leader, the irritant continues to exist. And the fact that the US continues to have a need and a security relationship with the Pakistanis. Last, I would be, if I didn't mention, much of what we talk about in terms of a shared connection. If you read all the State Department documents, the White House documents, it's about two democracies working together on shared values. And so there are real concerns about illiberalism, shrinking space for democracy, dissent, minority rights in India. This is something US policymakers usually talk about in private. This is something Indian policymakers really chafe at, do not want to talk about. But it is something that I know from national security perspective, we continue to watch to see how does it limit India's ability to be that world leader? How does it limit their relations with other countries? and their ability to be a strong player both in the Quad and the Indo-Pacific. I'm going to leave it there, and hopefully we can engage more on questions. Thanks very much.
Tamanna, I'm afraid I just don't have any questions after what. No, that was fabulous. Thank you so much for that incredibly deep and robust dive into so many different aspects of India's global complexities. You know, in some ways, it sounds like all roads lead to New Delhi with the way that you've painted it. I think it's right. You know, there's so many places that we could dive in, but I do think, you know, if we could stick on this non-aligned movement for just a minute. That is something that I think a lot of US Americans are not familiar with. This idea that there are a good number of countries in the world who have not chosen sides. Obviously, the US is not one of those, right? The US with NATO and other alliances has taken a different route. But could you talk a little bit about the non-aligned movement and sort of how that functions globally?
You know, the non-aligned movement is something that really, you know, I'm not a historian of it, but it came up in the Cold War. And, you know, it's 120 countries who are not aligned formally with any major power bloc. It's at the UN, it's like the largest grouping of states. It came after the Korean War, and it was really to counterbalance the rapid bipolarization of the world. Really, even though India was clearly on the side of the Soviets, had much closer relationship with Soviets. And part of that was because we had very close relationships with Pakistan to fight in Afghanistan against the Russians. So there's a whole history there. I think what's important here, India has always been a leading voice in that, but I think it goes much beyond that actual grouping, right? I think you should think about it as Indian strategy, Indian national security and foreign policy thinkers do not want to be seen as, they use the word in Hindi or Urdu as ghulam. They don't want to be seen as the servant or the, you know, it's a very post-colonial, I mean, colonial states, you have to realize it's in their DNA. For so many years, I mean, we read, you know, we read in our textbooks about World War II. We don't hear about the millions of Indians who had to fight in Europe, who fought and died in World War II because they were a British colony, right? Millions of Indians did, right? Because even though Europe was not their battlefield, it wasn't their war, but as a British colony, so that has never left the DNA, right? That we do not want to be beholden to any other country. So we don't make us pick, right? Don't make us pick between US and Russia. Don't make us pick, or even if we choose, for example, we're countering China, we will do it for our own national security interests, not because the United States told us to do it, right? Not because we are beholden to some other power. And so that is the vision of, I wouldn't even call it non-aligned. It's about independence. It's about sovereignty, this idea of we are a strong, powerful nation. And I think that's grown over time, that we are a country in our own right, and we should decide these things for our own national security interests, as does the United States, as does every major country. And so they do not want to be locked down. You see this behavior in negotiations. They don't like to be locked down, whether it's a treaty on trade or on mutual protection. They don't want to be locked down in something where they don't have choices, right? They want to make decisions that are best for their national security. So it's frustrating as a US policymaker sometimes to, you know, getting to some of these great agreements that we had were not easy with the Indians because there is that streak of independence, right?
And it's so interesting because, you know, the India that we see today, the India that you have portrayed today, seems to be a very unified India. It's an India that has sort of a clear-eyed vision for where it's going. But as you know very well, I mean, that is not necessarily the on-the-ground reality in India. And it sounds like, based on the milestones you laid out, that is really something that India has had to step into in terms of how it's portraying itself to the world. Could you give us a sense of the internal complexity, just very briefly, of India? And you know, we call India the largest democracy on the planet. You know, how would you rate the strength of Indian democracy, and how effective is Prime Minister Modi at sort of bringing together the disparate groups within the subcontinent?
That's a great question. And I believe my comments here are off the record. I would want to say, you know, look, debates in foreign policy and national security are commonplace in India. It's a very vibrant space. So, you know, even when they're talking about relations with US, et cetera, Domestically, I think we have seen a closing of space for some debates. I think it's reflective of the rise of right-wing populism in a lot of countries across South Asia, in lots of other places, Europe, the US, a closing of space for dissent sometimes, a closing of space for liberalism in terms of freedom of press, freedom of speech, academic freedoms. There's a lot of professors who get, if they say something that does not fit the narrative, they may be fired, they may get canceled, what have you. But also, I think for minorities, for so-called Dalits, so lower caste individuals, caste and religion are very important ethnic markers in India, right? And so how you interpret your history and vision really matter, and politics is a big part of that. I think some of it stems from the Congress Party, which is a very much left of center, this idea of a liberal democracy with thriving minorities. You have to understand the reality of India is that it is so diverse that literally every 50 kilometers, you could argue the language changes, the food changes. We think of it as a monolith, and maybe that's how we've experienced it. But really, there's so much diversity in India. And so it is, what are the threads that are tying this country together? And the regionalism is very important in India. So Congress Party, which is seen as this liberal democrat, left of center party, over time ruled for decades and decades. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of corruption, a lot of poverty, a lot of inability to deliver. And what you see in the rise of BJP is, I think, a reaction to that, right? It's reflective of world trends, but it is this idea, there's a Hindu nationalist idea, but it's an idea of a strong India, India for Indians, not to be afraid of their identity, a lot of positive things. I think Modi has been able to deliver economic growth in certain ways. He's been able to deliver revived ties, not just with the US and other great world powers. You can see it across Africa, across the Middle East, across the Indo-Pacific. So he's been able to deliver there. And I think he's tapped into, as many right-wing populists do, a grievance, a majoritarian grievance that, the minorities, whether they're religious or ethnic or linguistic minorities, have gotten too much space in our society. And so I don't think Modi started it or BJP started it. I think it was always, existent, but he's been able to tap into that. And as really, BJP is now the strongest national level party. Again, I don't spend a lot of time on Indian politics, but I would say the real competition for BJP right now is in regional parties. It is not in the Congress Party. It's regional parties have a lot of power. They reflect, each state of India has a different mentality, a different identity. It sees itself as part of the whole, but it wants to maintain, just as in the United States, each state sort of has its own, but I would say in India, it's even more magnified. So in a parliamentary system, it's important that these local regional parties have a lot more sway than small parties would in the US system.
Yeah, and as we're thinking about how India is sort of coming into its own on the world stage in so many ways, obviously diplomacy is an important part of that, and sort of the intentional outreach of a country to other countries and maintaining those official relationships. But soft power has a lot to do with how a country can develop trust and develop relationships and possibilities and opportunities, especially in this non-aligned way that you're talking about. Could you talk a little bit more? You said in your opening remarks a little bit about the Indian diaspora. I think it's very notable right now. We are in an unknown or previously unknown period in British politics at the moment, where the sitting prime minister of the United Kingdom is a person of Indian origin. What does that matter? What does that mean to have such a widespread diaspora in terms of how India sees itself in the world?
I mean, I think you can't understate the impact, right? India is cool now. When I was growing up, I mean, my parents are from India. When I was growing up in Ohio, if my mom packed Indian food in my lunchbox in the 80s, it was definitely not cool. But now, for our holidays, I'd have henna on my hands and all the kids would be like, what's that? And now people go to like their state fair and get henna tattoos. I mean, it is a sea change, right? You see it on Disney. I think the soft power is really important. As you said, you have Indian diaspora all over the world. And you see it. I mean, our own vice president is half Indian. The prime minister of the UK is of Indian descent. We had an Irish prime minister who was of part Indian. And this is just remarkable. I mean, you have defense ministers in Canada who are of Indian, who are, turban Sikh Indians, right? This is not, so it's very normal. I would also argue economic power really matters. I mean, think about top CEOs of tech, not just tech, but beyond tech. Now you have of luxury brands, of Starbucks, of all these things are Indian they're not Indian diaspora even, they're Indian educated CEOs, many of these. So I think that matters a lot. But even before you get to the US and multinationals, think about the influence across the Middle East. I mean, half of the Middle East wouldn't run without expat workers, architects, engineers, everything from your taxi driver to the engineer who designed a building to advisors. So, I mean, so many parts of the world. I was just on a flight from New Delhi to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, which you'd never think, full of Indian engineers, right? We're thinking about Chinese influence in Africa, but the Indians have a relationship with Africa that's, centuries old, and they're welcome there in terms of infrastructure. Probably they're huge diasporas in South Africa, in South America, the Caribbean, in the Indo-Pacific, Australia, Malaysia, Indonesia. So this, and the power, I think, of Bollywood, of culture, of music, it's exponential. And I think this has really shifted the way people see India, but the way that India can actually export its soft power.
Oh, it's fascinating, right? I mean, New York City is giving Diwali as a holiday now for public schools, right? So it really is having an impact.
I was just at Secretary Blinken hosted a Diwali reception it was the first time ever at the State Department. You had and you had so many Indian Americans who actually serve in government, in the US government.
And so we really shouldn't underestimate, like you're saying, that cultural influence and that soft power. I do want to pivot a little bit to a point you made in your remarks about sort of countering Chinese influence, right? The Belt and Road Initiative, I think many of our attendees will know, is China's longstanding effort, right? Infrastructure project across multiple continents to really plant Chinese influence and be able to develop trust and so on. But it sounds like India may be doing some similar things. Has India started to build out similar projects to that, maybe in a less formal way?
Yeah, I mean, I think Indian companies are. So, right, I think it's harder for the Indian state. It is a democracy like the United States. It's not a state-controlled economy like China. So, Belt and Road and CPEC, all of these things are state-controlled largely. India, like the US, doesn't do that, right? You see in regional places, the Indian government directly going. So, for example, Sri Lanka is a great example. It went into default earlier this year. Its loans, lots of Chinese loans. It was India that bailed out Sri Lanka, not China, right? And so if you're thinking about the India-China competition, it is playing out in real time in some of these countries. I think where you see a huge impact is Indian businesses. For example, the Adani ports. Adani is now one of the richest people in the world. You didn't hear about him before just a few years ago, but he owns ports. These are public-private partnerships across the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And it's significant, right? You are building infrastructure for people, and it doesn't have the same flack or sort of, because it is private power, it doesn't have the same, I think, bad press that a lot of Chinese investment gets. But yes, you have across Africa. And I would temper that by saying the capacity of the Indians to compete with the Chinese is obviously, it's relative. The Indians don't have the capacity, the resources on a state level. I think companies definitely are looking for market share everywhere, are doing a good job competing with the Indians. I mean, they're now competing, as I mentioned, tractors, but on every front. You have partnerships with the South Koreans making cars that are being exported. We won't necessarily see it in the West, but where we do see it is in Asia and the Middle East. So you have competitors, excuse me, coming from India that are cost effective, that rival China, and that are indigenous, right? And so those are great for, I would say, the region. More importantly, I think it's how the Quad can work. How can the Quad actually offer, IPEF is this new Indo-Pacific Economic Forum. Can it offer, and that's yet to be seen, can it actually offer financial alternatives. I think the test is in countries like Sri Lanka and other places where you're getting close to default, where the economic situation post-COVID, post the war in Ukraine, are just, these global shocks have defaulted, so are leading so many countries to be on an IMF program, to get close to default. Basically, that era of leaders, getting cheap loans is going away. So I think the question is, how does India and the rest of the Quad, how do they actually go in and help these countries rather than these countries have to go to China as their debtors? So.
Yeah, and it'll be fascinating to watch the implications on U.S. economic decisions as well, right? As corporations are becoming increasingly entwined in Indian society, right? Are they able to extricate themselves from maybe some Chinese entanglements as well? We've got some great questions coming in from the audience, and please, everyone, do continue to send those in so we can get to them. I think we do need to talk a little bit more, Tamanna, if we can, about the nuclear question. We have a question coming in from Chris Whalen asking whether you ever see India joining the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. They obviously wouldn't give up their nuclear weapons, but would they be admitted as a weapon state? Do you see a future for them in that dialogue?
I mean, I think they would love to be in the NPT, right? It's not that they wouldn't. To be a signatory of the NPT means you've sort of gotten the blessing. I mean, if you are a group that has really kind of reached that, but I don't think they're at a place where they want to be, where they want to sign on to this treaty, right? Again, it comes back to their independence. They don't want to be locked in because they have two nuclear neighbors, China and Pakistan. I think there's just a lot of political constraints on them. I mean, eventually I think they'd want to be, but I think that to get there, we would have to recognize them into the group of nuclear countries. And I think there's a lot of countries who wouldn't, China, the US, we're not necessarily there, right? So can we, if we accept them into the nuclear club, then even though in practice we have, right? But it's officially that we haven't. So until and unless they get there, I don't think they would sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
And for people who are maybe following a daily news digest, but just haven't zoomed into this part of the world recently, I mean, are tensions cooler now between India and Pakistan? Is Kashmir doing okay? I mean, or are things just not being talked about because there are more sort of pressing news stories?
Right. I mean, I think you have to think about this, right? For 20 years, we were in Afghanistan. We were paying a lot more attention to this region because of our huge troop presence. After our withdrawal, I think the attention and resources has really depleted. When we think about India and the Indo-Pacific, we're thinking maritime, we're thinking countering China, Taiwan, all of these things. But for India, its territorial concerns are very, very real. They see our withdrawal in Afghanistan as a betrayal in some ways, that we left them, they're in the those terrorist threats are sitting on their doorstep. We can be an ocean or two away. They are not. Secondly, I think you have seen in 2019 with the Pulwama Balakot incident. I mean, I don't want to get into it too much, but there's an attack in Kashmir, in the Indian part of Kashmir, that's traced back to Pakistan. It was the first time Indian jets actually are shooting into what you would call outside of the disputed territory. So the mainland of Pakistan, there's a downed fighter pilot, he's exchanged. I mean, this is a very tense period of 10 days, but I think there's a couple lessons to be learned here. One, the influence of the US in being able to de-escalate was far less than, I worked in Embassy Islamabad during the Mumbai crisis. We had, Secretary Rice and others on the phone. The influence and ability of the United States to calm Delhi and Islamabad down was far different, right? Second, we were much more clearly on the sides of the Indians. I mean, it might be particular to the Trump administration, but National Security Advisor Bolton's statements, his public statements, were really read as a green light in India to take a more aggressive stance. And that might be the fact that we are much more on the side of India than Pakistan now. So we're not in the middle as an honest mediator, you could say. Third, the lesson that both sides took was that we can be more aggressive, it will work out, and it will benefit us domestically, which is a very dangerous lesson to take away, rather than we don't have mechanisms in place, we don't have regularized, mechanisms to de-escalate tensions. We don't have ways to talk to each other. And that followed with 2019, the changing of the status of Jammu and Kashmir. Since then, India-Pakistan ties were really at the nadir. They, took diplomatic ties. They both removed their ambassadors. The only positive in that, and then in 2020, you have the China-India dust up and go on. So since 2019, you've really had what I would argue is a very dangerous situation. We do see some positives. Since 2021, we've had a ceasefire back in between, on the line of control between India and Pakistan. They've quietly held that ceasefire. There is a quiet back channel between the two countries. There's an intelligence hotline. For example, earlier this year, there was a mistaken missile fired. It was by accident fired from India into Pakistan. Imagine if that was happening during a level of high tensions, right? If a missile, an errant missile, flies into your territory from your arch enemy, you don't take it so kindly. Thankfully, it was not during that. They could use the back channel to communicate that it was a mistake, and both sides took a calm approach. But again, this is really, it's dependent on what's going on. It's dependent on leadership. And I think the thing that complicates it most is in Pakistan, it's very domestic politics. Anti-Indianism works very well, and the mirror effect. In India, whenever there's a domestic election coming off, anti-Pakistan rhetoric plays very well to the masses. So there isn't a great incentive structure for them to solve the underlying issues, or even have institutional mechanisms to manage the current risk of escalation.
Gosh, I mean, just giving us a sense of how messy and complicated these situations can be. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the Quad Alliance, if we could, which I think for some people, maybe who don't follow the region, seems like a sort of unusual grouping of countries to have Australia, India, Japan, and the United States working together. Can you give us a sense of where this came from? Obviously, we're talking about, again, keeping China in check. And I'll just add a quick side note that if I understand correctly, India is part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is yet another layer of sort of complexity and sort of involvement between the two countries. But with the Quad Alliance, where did that come from, and what are sort of the primary goals for that grouping of countries?
Sure. I mean, late Prime Minister Abe of Japan is known as like the father of the Quad, and it actually came into place, in for tsunami relief back in 2007. It was really a way to help, I guess, take care of all the different countries across the Indo-Pacific that were suffering after the 2004 tsunami, right? That's really when it was an ad hoc group, the Indian Ocean earthquake and followed by the tsunami. Those were sort of the precursor. It sort of fell off when Australia pulled out and was trying to make nice with China. But really in 2007, that's when Abe, then Australian Prime Minister John Howard, Manmohan Singh, Indian Prime Minister, and US Vice President Dick Cheney met. And the dialogue was paralleled with joint military exercises that at a scale that had never been done before. And it was widely viewed as a response to increased Chinese economic and military power. Let's call a spade, right? It is about countering China. Now, interestingly, in the Quad framework and in all of their meetings, China is not mentioned. It's not explicit that we are countering China. It is about upholding a rules-based international order in the Indo-Pacific, right? And so there's economic parts to it, there's military parts. Some analysts argue that it needs to have a more security, stronger teeth. I think all four countries are a little wary of that. They don't want to make this big alliance that obviously China chafes at everything the Quad does. It's not like China doesn't understand that this is a countering China alliance. But I think a lot of these countries, India in particular, likes to do things bilaterally as well. So you have the Quad Alliance that is doing things. There's a lot of movement. They're meeting all the time now. I mean, the pace of the meetings at every level in all of these different areas, economic, technology, energy, health, you name it, they're meeting, they're working. Governments are trying to align themselves in what they're doing across the Indo-Pacific. Now you have to think about this. It is a huge space. It's like more than half the world's population. It's huge space, a lot of issues, and big countries. So, it's thinking of it, and you asked why these four. I mean, these are largely like the democracies that can come together and have influence in this area and want to counter China. A lot of the work is also done bilaterally. So, for example, on Sri Lanka, the Quad didn't come in, but both Japan and India did. And they both have good relations there, and they coordinate with the US. A lot of the US-India stuff is done bilaterally and not under the guise of the Quad. And so I think it's a good alignment organization. I think some of the work will continue to be done bilaterally.
I mean, we have a question from the audience that sort of gets to I mean, do you think that can this last? I mean, all of these, the balancing of all of these different relationships, and the audience member points out that some of these are in natural competition or conflict.
Tension with each other. Yeah, I mean, but I think that is, I think China is the organizing principle, right? They all, if you think about it, I think the test is what can they deliver, right? I think they will last in that as long as they have, they want to compete with China, they're trying to counter China. Again, there's differences in approach, right? India shares a huge border with China. It's very different than us. India is so enmeshed. Each of these countries are enmeshed with China in different ways. And so they have different limits on how far they're willing to go. As you mentioned, India is a big player in SCO. They were at the summit. Pointedly, that's where Modi in his meeting with Putin, Modi did not meet with Xi. I think that was a very significant thing. I mean, the comments, I think, or, the comments between Modi and Xi are such that Xi would like China-India relations to go back to the good old days. Let's just forget about everything that happened. China's not going to change anything. China's not going to make anything better, but we can keep going. And India is not standing for that. India, there are real grievances. There's a real problem. They're not taking their eye off Beijing. I think SCO is really interesting because it's also where India sees Russia and the Modi-Putin relationship. I think a lot of analysts in the US keep pointing to his statements, his very public statements, criticizing Putin. And I think they're valid, but I don't think they undercut the importance of the India-Russia relationship more structurally.
Tamanna, one of the most interesting ways, I think, over time that India has contributed to the world is through its role in the United Nations. India obviously has a significant history with the UN, a significant contributor to peacekeeping forces around the world. Can you talk a little bit about how India sees its role or involvement in the United Nations and why that matters at this point in time?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, and if many of you might remember during the Obama years, they advocated and we supported them for a role on the UN, Security Council. That didn't happen. But they see the UN, they are an early adopter and believer in multilateralism in the nations of the world, definitely a leader in sort of BRICS and other things, the countries of the global South having a voice and not being dominated by erstwhile colonial powers. And so they early on have seen the UN as a means to that. I think they are committed. There's a whole a generation of bureaucrats and civil servants in India who believe in, who have worked at the UN. They're one of the world's largest contributors to UN peacekeeping forces. And so they see it as a point of pride. They have lots and lots of Indian diplomats serving in the UN system. And it is about showing that India is this world-class power that plays on the world stage, that cares about the international world order and rules. And that's why I think it's so surprising. You're seeing as India grows into a world power, there's a move by some who say that's a little too Pollyannish, right? And that we need to be more practical and push Indian national interests where Indian national interests matter. So I think that's an ongoing debate, but I don't think you're gonna, India believes in the UN unless it's about UN getting involved in any of their, internal, for example, Kashmir. They would never want the UN involved in that. But on a world scale, on a world stage, they're very happy. And that's why it's really important also for them to have allies at the UN. So, to counter China, for example, China goes to bat usually for Pakistan. Russia has gone to bat for India. And so it's an important alliance there.
You mentioned the BRICS countries earlier, which, it goes back a while now. Haven't heard much about it recently. We do have a question from the audience about this. I mean, is this a model that is still active, talking about Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa? And certainly, I mean, with Russia's military actions, it seems like that would make it lose some of its integrity anyway, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think BRICS is preeminent. The 2022 was in China. And India didn't, I believe, if I remember, I mean, I don't follow BRICS that closely, but what I remember is that India maybe didn't show up at this year. I mean, they showed up, but virtually, so they didn't come in person. They're looking to expand. Saudi Arabia and some other countries want to join. It's largely an economic alliance. But I think SCO is in some ways more important. India is not going to pull out, but I think they're broadening their I guess options.
Yeah. What do you think has to happen for India to be considered in the same breath as some of the other world powers? It seems like India has been sort of, I don't know, sneaking up, if you will, right? Like we hear about great power competition, we think of US, Russia, and China, but as you pointed out very well, there are so many reasons to start considering India in the same breath.
Yeah.
But it's just not, what is the line or the threshold that has to be crossed?
Yeah, I mean, I just think, I mean, for them, that's why they wanted a seat at the UN National Security Council. I think they see it as China saying, yes, you're an important country, but you're not that important, right? Like people sort of brush them off, and definitely China is one of those countries in their view that brushes them off. I think they're trying. I think economic growth is really important, building, lifting all of their population up, being in these world forum. I can't give you metrics, but I definitely think that economic growth, political power globally, and they are very, very concerned about their military power, right? Military power matters. And they have a huge military, both conventional and in terms of nuclear weapons. But I think that's where they're looking to compete on the world stage.
And it sounds like to this point, most of their focus in terms of regional has been basically regional, right? So Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or other places in the region.
Yeah, and I think there are conflicts like the India-Pakistan conflict that drag them back down into a very regional focus. And I think there are thinkers in India who want to move beyond that and think on a more global scale. But economically, you could say India is there. They are very much plugged into supply chains in the tech sector, and they're growing. An interesting development that in addition to the Quad, they're in this new configuration of I2U2, which you probably would never have guessed. It's India, Israel, the UAE, and the US. And
wow.
We can laugh at it because it doesn't do that much, but it is nascent, and it is really focused on economic integration between these countries. So it's sort of India's nod at even the Abraham Accords, and you would be surprised how much integration there is between India, Israel, India, UAE, and now UAE, Israel. So the US when the president was just in Israel, he participated in the summit, ITU2 summit, but it is very much an economic investment tool. So you have big countries like rich countries like the UAE investing in the tech sector in India.
Yeah, Tamanna, this has been a fascinating and a fabulous conversation, and we're just so grateful for your time and insights today on India. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and I thank everyone in your audience for their interest, and I hope you guys keep talking about this. Thanks.
Absolutely. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us for this installment of the Global Motivation Series. We'll be back in the next couple of weeks with the final 2 installments looking at Japan and China. So do stay with us and check us out online at irckc.org. Thanks again.